department in Western University. Her deep knowledge of the field of cinematic installation art, new media art, and the relationship between cinema, the visual arts, cultural memory, nostalgia, representation of history in film and television is crucial. She has started to work at the intersection of arts, film, cultural memory, and artificial intelligence. Having recently published a case study on the confluence of these four things, today she is suggested to ground her talk in that research, but also some of the newer trajectories she is pursuing with respect to AI, specifically are these critical interventions in machine learning to address the ethics of its uses. So I'm really excited to listen to her talk, and welcome again, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Sprengler.
Oh, thank you so much for such a wonderful and warm welcome. I really appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit about my research. And yes, I'm going to ground some of this in a case study that really sparked my interest at first in AI and art, although I sort of developed it in a slightly different way. So I want to come back to that work here in the context, more specifically about this kind of critical intervention into AI, and then add a few extra works in as well. But this is new to me. So I'm going to end my presentation with questions, a lot of questions, because I feel like I don't yet have the answers, but I have a lot of questions. So if anyone sort of wants to feel free to help me work through some of these questions, either with answers or complications or other trajectories, that would be most welcome. So thank you so much again. I will share my screen here and hope it all works. Let's see. Try this. And
yes,
we can appear. Yes, okay.
Yes, no problem. It's okay. It's cool.
There we go. Okay, wonderful. So I've titled my talk Machinations of Memory, Art and Artificial Intelligence. And I want to start with a news story, and I'm going to quote this news story at some length because it's really quite fascinating, I think. But it was a minor story and one that didn't get too much attention initially. And it was posted online about 5 years ago. So this is the story, and I quote, "Just recently, Warner Brothers issued a DMCA takedown notice." Oh, I may have a problem. Oh, let's see if I can. There we go. A DMCA takedown notice to the video streaming website Vimeo. The notice concerned a pretty standard list of illegally uploaded files from media properties Warner owns the copyright to, including an upload featuring footage from the Ridley Scott movie Blade Runner. Just a routine example of copyright infringement, right? Not exactly. Warner Brothers had just made a fascinating mistake. The Blade Runner footage, which Warner has since reinstated, wasn't actually Blade Runner footage, or rather it was, but not in any form the world had ever seen. Instead, it was a part of a unique machine-learned encoding project, one that had attempted to reconstruct the classic Philip K. Dick android fable from a pile of disassembled data. In other words, Warner had just DMCA'd an artificial reconstruction of a film about artificial intelligence being indistinguishable from humans because its own AI couldn't distinguish between the simulation and the real thing, end quote. So this is the work that really first sparked my interest in AI in relation to art, and when I first saw it at the Whitney as a fairly unassuming installation. But it also serves well a few other interests of mine, namely art about film and art's capacity to produce analyses and knowledge about things in ways that written discourse can't. In this particular case, insight into machine learning and AI. Now, the work in question is Terence Broad's Blade Runner auto-encoded from 2016. This work is a fascinating creative gesture that intervenes in a series of questions about memory. It cites practices, enabling technologies, visual registers, and possible futures. I want to start with Broad's work and then conclude with a few others that remain concerned with memory, but extend their critical engagement with AI in other directions as well. They are works that heed a number of recent calls from AI researchers themselves to turn to art, to research creation for guidance. For instance, Tobias Rees writes that, quote, "We need artists who can identify those instances where AI exceeds the already thought and known and can make these instances visible, available as an invitation to imagine things otherwise," end quote. For Luke Stark and Kate Crawford, the imperative to involve artists in AI research is tied to ethics. They see artists as a, quote, "significant but often undervalued community able to speak directly to the changing and nuanced ethical questions faced by those who use data, machine learning, and AI in their work," end quote. Now, memory is a central concern in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and the subject of much philosophical reflection in the critical literature on the film. For these reasons, Broad selected it as the first test case for his research in deep learning and machine memory, a project intended to fulfill his degree requirement in creative computing at Goldsmiths. So how did Broad make this work? Well, he enlisted Blade Runner to develop an autoencoder, one that had the capacity to not only recognize images, but after training, to generate them as well. Now, an autoencoder is an artificial neural network, or in other words, an artificial brain. It can be thought of as two networks, and he explains it in this way. He says it's one that takes input, such as an image, and encodes it into a latent or numerical representation, shrinking it down, and then another that decodes this latent representation and then reassembles and resequences the image. Now, the impetus for this endeavor was a 2011 article in Current Biology that reported on scientists' ability to translate brain activity patterns from an MRI data into actual images. In other words, we can now see what people are thinking. In Broad's case, the quality of these reconstructed images depends on how well the autoencoder was trained. An early part of this training also involved extraneous decoy images, ones added to help the autoencoder learn to differentiate what belonged to Blade Runner and what did not. Each time, the sum total of Blade Runner's frames and others were fed as a data set into the machine, and this is a process that takes 3 days, and it's called an epoch. Its capacity to issue back a recognizable image improved. But the machine does not, quote unquote, remember everything. And what it cannot, it makes up based on an amalgam of what it does recall. It also makes decisions on how to remember. Black screens are rare in the film, so it did not bother to remember what they looked like, issuing instead a kaleidoscopic array of colors that approximate the pictorial average of what it had already processed. Although Broad was surprised by how well the autoencoder could reconstruct the film from memory, there were other strange lapses. For instance, it had a fair bit of trouble with human faces, unable to recognize the features that differentiated individuals. And moments of what seemed like protracted stillness featuring close-ups might nevertheless register as a flurry of activity. Now, I'm going to hope this works. I'm going to let some of this play while I speak to a little bit of what happens here. So hopefully, oh, I think I see it. And there won't be any sound. So I'll just let this play for a couple of minutes while I speak. So our natural proclivity to attend to what the autoencoder got wrong throws up a litany of failures that are instructive for thinking about memory and technologies of memory. And it is this past imperfect, these so-called failures, that I would like to consider for a moment, extending some of Broad's own concerns in this regard. For I think there is something to be learned when things go wrong, when expectations aren't met, when stumbling blocks or intractable problems are encountered. There is value in reflecting on why we think a problem is a problem and what these purported failures might reveal about our aims in the first place. More broadly, should the goals we set for ourselves when engaging AI really be our goals? For instance, in Broad's effort to, quote, emphasize the ambiguous boundary between our memory of the film and the neural networks, he found some of the flaws in its visual reconstruction are actually reminiscent of the deficiencies of our own. One such shared deficiency involves the memory of movement. How, for instance, do we remember movement? And more specifically, the movement of the image in film? Do we recall the complex choreography of a fight scene or the aerial acrobatics performed by a camera tasked with describing a city? And if the details of such things evade us, what do we recall in their stead? How do we recount different speeds of motion? Or do we invent possible movements to compose a fuller picture of what may have happened? What role do different technologies of representation and remembrance play in processing, structuring, and entrenching memories of various types of images? Broad's autoencoder takes the dynamism of bodies in conflict, vehicles in motion, and sweeping pans of the camera, and reduces them sometimes to incomprehensible blurs and shimmers of light, a veritable aurora borealis. Even static objects are afforded this treatment. Whenever a light source is present, it becomes animated by shimmering hues that often fill the frame with motion. But however omnipresent these moving lights appear in Blade Runner, their speed of flickering is quickened and their presence overemphasized by the autoencoder. In fact, it seems as though the AI understood the primacy accorded to this cinematic strategy to mean that it ought to be applied almost universally to all sources of light in the film. But is this something the AI got wrong, or does it represent a somewhat more poetic bypass into a deeper truth? On the one hand, this movement foregrounds the light that constitutes the cinematic image. Cinema is light, seems to be the AI's argument, an oft heard one to be sure. On the other hand, this flickering also moves us beyond an encounter with filmic images and into a reflection on the nature of matter itself, a visualization of Einsteinian physics that demonstrates how at the atomic level, seemingly stable objects are constituted by the continual movement of particles across mostly empty space. The AI demonstrated a fair bit of difficulty with bodies, sometimes imposing on them a stillness not in the original film. Human figures would be held in abeyance a little too long before disintegrating into apparitions. At times, the background seemed to change before the body that occupied it moved, upending expectations with respect to container and event, background and action, figure and ground, and in the process, the temporality of scenes. The autoencoder also had tremendous difficulty capturing small bodily gestures, such as movements of the mouth during speech. Small differences of this sort were replaced by calculated averages. Broad explains that, quote, the model collapses large periods of similar frames, that is, a fixed camera shot of a character talking, into one representation, usually the most common frame, thus giving long sequences of an actor's face not blinking or making facial gestures. Close-ups featuring dialogue therefore revealed an extreme disjuncture between image and sound. For Blade Runner's soundtrack was overlaid, fully audible, and free from any sonic distortions. Now, for the most part, the stiller the image, the sharper its resolution, and the more precise the machine's memory of it. As such, Blade Runner autoencoded, like Blade Runner itself, opens up space for engaging the myriad ways in which photography and memory are imbricated, especially given the way photographs feature as privileged objects in the film. The visual clarity of such moments is an effect of training. Photographs are still images and offer more frames of the same thing for the autoencoder to study. Theoretically, if the autoencoder is trained well enough, all its images will bear the clarity of these close-up shots of photographs. The end of its march toward realism, the kind that underpins certain stretches in the history of painting and video game development, may yield a perfect memory of the film. But what is gained by this? And perhaps a more advanced artificial intelligence, the possibility for a more complex understanding of indexicality, But what is lost? Indeed, Broad thinks we also ought to confront the losses resulting from achieving the holy grail of perfect verisimilitude. For it is through such failures that we might raise new questions about our own cognitive processes. Blade Runner Auto-Encoded does important work in focusing our attention on technology and memory, but it also risks closing off the social and political dimensions of such things, including questions around labor, power, gender, race, and the environment that Scott's film purposefully and sometimes problematically invokes. This is a concern for Broad too, who is not really troubled by the idea of Skynet super AIs taking over everything. Instead, he is more disturbed by the evidence that neural networks take biases. This fear is well-founded, for we do know how Blade Runner Auto-Encoded erases the already marginalized presence of people of color in the film. Scott purposefully sought to populate his futuristic Los Angeles with multiple ethnicities, but these actors were primarily extras and thus not afforded close-ups or much screen time, rendering their presence virtually unreadable by the AI. As such, we do not know how the autoencoder would remember different skin tones. Only white faces accorded lengthy close-ups. We can also see the very limited ways in which the AI processes visual metaphors and allegorical engagements, in this case, with slavery and colonialism. If Blade Runner makes us call into question our own relation to memory, then Blade Runner Auto-Encoded extends some of these questions in new directions. Beyond looking like memory, as some critics claim, Broad's work also forces us to confront the future of memory, its formation, storage, articulation, circulation, possibilities, and failings, and how the labor of remembering is offloaded. How do new technologies of representation intervene in recollection? And what role might creative works play in restructuring our mnemonic engagements with films and the textual universe that surrounds them? But like other forms of AI, the smarter it gets, the less accessible its operations become. We have little insight into the processes by which machines learn. What an AI application does with the information we feed it happens behind closed doors, as it were. Broad, for example, explained that he could not accurately predict what his autoencoder would do with Blade Runner, how it would remember the film. Moreover, by defining learning as the capacity to visually replicate something, actually reverses one of the film's defining arguments, that seeing does not necessarily lead to knowing, and that memory is flawed in ways that extend beyond a failure to reproduce details. As Scott Buchatman makes clear, quote, in Blade Runner, the more we see, the more our uncertainty grows. Vision is no guarantee of truth, and the film's complexity encourages us to rethink our assumptions about perception by reminding us that, like memory, vision is more than a given natural process, end quote. Victor Bergen gives us a compelling account of cinematic memory through his concept of the image envelope, registers of the already seen and already heard, the debris of films detached from their original contexts, but nevertheless saturated with affect and significance. Broad's gesture intervenes with a caveat, seen and heard by whom or by what. But sometimes this seeing, or already having been seen, is even more complicated than that. Sometimes there are images of a certain type that we are familiar with, that circulate in particularly charged contexts, that get mobilized in deeply problematic political ways, that find themselves a core part of something now unseen, but nevertheless highly determining in the realm of AI. This is at issue in Trevor Paglen's They Took the Faces from the Accused and the Dead. Paglen is interested in the black box, or typically inaccessible training sets used to teach AI systems vast amounts of data, and data that are often suffused with what he identifies as a range of, quote, biases, assumptions, errors, and ideological positions. In this work, Paglen mines images from the American National Standards Institute database, an archive of mugshots of individuals both convicted and simply accused. As such, his work functions as a form of visual evidence of racist policing practices in the United States. This archive of images was once the chief source of visual data for developing facial recognition technologies. While this now falls to social media, Paglen's work is a reminder of the violations of privacy enacted in the development of training data, the ideological forces that are sidestepped in these processes, and the simple fact that, as Paglen argues, quote, AI is political. Paglen's display of these portraits, over 3,000 in total as silver gelatin prints, also recalls older classification impulses, earlier photographic practices steeped in physiognomy, phrenology, and social Darwinism, as Claudia Schmuckli reminds us. As such, it contains something of the historical or cultural memory of past media uses of these images, and exposes the ways in which they continue to inform practices today, including AI processes often hidden from view. Guido Steyrl takes on a similar subject in The City of Broken Windows, a large and multifaceted installation here as exhibited at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. This work involves two screens positioned on easels, AI-generated wall text, and historical citations involving broken window theories in relation to crime prediction, economic vitality, and civic disorder, deeply problematic assumptions that have informed AI-supported predictive policing practices. One screen plays a documentary about an urban revitalization initiative featuring volunteers who paint flowers on boarded up windows in Camden, New Jersey. The other screen shows footage of experiments undertaken by engineers generating audio recordings of breaking windows for sound recognition software. These sounds of shattering glass are then used to train AI applications for alarm systems. Historical continuities are at issue here, including the ways in which older theories, like those of 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat, quoted by Steyrl in the wall text, are repurposed to fatal ends in the case of police shootings of Black citizens in the United States, and how past events like Kristallnacht resonate through the images and sounds that constitute the work. What Steyrl offers here is an astute critique of lineages of thinking and practice that inform AI applications. It is thus a kind of historical memory at issue here, one etched into images, texts, practices, and now AI training sets. Whereas Paglen and Steyrl reveal the ideological forces that permeate AI's uses in terms of their impact on racialized and marginalized subjectivities, Stephanie Dinkins takes a two-pronged approach to AI, critiquing, as Paglen and Steyrl do, the impact of AI and data collection practices on such constituencies, but also finding ways to carve out a space for the inclusion of those typically excluded from the development of AI technologies. For an initiative called AI Assembly, started in 2017 at the New Museum and now housed at the Data and Society Research Institute, Dinkins generates the opportunity for collaboration and discussion. And specifically, she writes, and this is worth quoting at length as her mandate, quote, "As people of color, women, the disabled, the LGBTQ+, and other vulnerable communities disproportionately impacted by data-centric technologies, we must find tangible ways to insert ourselves into the creation, training, and testing of algorithmic matrices that apprise us now and will continue to do so in the future with ever-increasing consequences. These systems are encoded with the same biases responsible for the myriad systemic injustices we experience today. We can no longer afford to be passive consumers or oblivious subjects to algorithmic systems that significantly impact how and where we live, who we love, and our ability to build and distribute wealth," end quote. These works take a critical approach to AI, considering both the histories and memories that get carried along its visual training vectors, but also in Dinkins' case, how problematic algorithms can be challenged. Another area of inquiry, and one that tends to capture the attention of the popular press and some philosophers, has to do with AI's capacity to create art. That is not my concern here, but there are a series of questions, really a flurry of questions, that ought to be asked of all the points of contact between art and AI, and it is with some of these that I wish to conclude. Now, what follows is a bit of a long and incomplete and somewhat messy laundry list of queries. It is also a list that returns us to Tobias Rees's request noted at the start of this talk to consider the ways in which artists render visible and available for analysis that which is not yet known about AI. Indeed, to start, by integrating AI into their creative practices, artists are exploring what creativity, materiality, the nature of work, and the role of the artist even means. Their work often asks what sorts of insights are possible to glean about the nature of AI itself as a tool, a medium, a technology, or perhaps simply an uncategorizable entity. How precisely are these artists marshaling a strong enough critical or affective charge, one capable of prompting meaningful confrontations with the ethics and well-documented problems of AI? How does AI force us to consider the future of things like learning, representation, production, innovation, creativity, copyright, memory, authorship, and knowledge itself? Are we reinventing the wheel when we open up these debates about art in relation to AI, or does AI offer new perspectives? For instance, to what extent do we need to rethink authorship if we are coming up against a century of already well-established challenges to the author or artist's power through ready-mades, collaborative works, participatory works, practices of sampling and appropriation, and half a century of computer art, algorithmic art? What new considerations specifically might AI and machine learning introduce into this discussion? We might also ask how histories of art can play a role in helping us conceptualize what AI even is in artistic terms. Should we think about it like a medium such as paint, a medium with inherent properties requiring exploration? What sorts of artistic precedents are being activated in these practices? There is a tendency to explore a new medium or technology with recourse to much older ones, well-entrenched familiar ones. Indeed, there is no shortage of AI-generated portraits or landscapes. These are safe and legible in many respects, but this approach is not without its pitfalls. For the problems, biases, exclusions, and other tendencies aligned with older media, even in some of its most seemingly creative anti-establishment forms or genres, may simply filter through into its newer iterations. Moreover, how do we process our responses to AI works? What existing categories or concepts do we employ? For instance, how do we make use of aesthetic criteria in relation to AI works? Take the concept of beauty. I've noticed that AI artworks are often treated in the popular press with sample images that are quite frankly stunning. But what of the dangers of aestheticization? Are we being seduced by technological spectacle? And if so, at what cost? Even if the original motivation driving a work may be something more critical, like using climate data to generate new visualizations, how do we engage with high resolution, ornately patterned, and sometimes sublime images that result? Does their beauty obfuscate the input, the process, the significance of the data that is ultimately being visualized? Again, this is not a new question for art, and perhaps there is a space to reinvigorate some older critiques of culture that have been leveled against art of the past, for they might be instructive in pointing the way forward for how to remain critical, analytical, and vigilant in the face of new creative possibilities opened up by AI. That is, aware of both its potential and limitations, aware of how we can use AI, but also challenge it. Thank you. I will stop trying to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you very much, Christine. Actually, it was a surprise for me to see you focus on Blade Runner because it's one of the cult movies that we focus on my lectures with my students. when we are talking. Yeah, I really love it. The original version of it, actually, and the other one, the newer one. But I really love the theme of cyberpunk and the alienation and the representation issue is so important for me too. So I'm really glad that my students heard about these issues in a different point of view. So thank you very much. I really loved the details in your presentation. So I guess there is a question here from Ensar, one of our students. He's one of our brilliant students. Can humanoid robots be an improved version of the encoder?
Oh, perhaps. I mean, there may be ways in which you could sort of see them as kindred spirits in a way, right? So a kind of manifestation, a bodily manifestation of this autoencoder. But I mean, it's just different ways, perhaps, of entrenching the processes that are really at work in both, perhaps. That's such an interesting question. Oh, apologies. I just saw the other notes there. They didn't appear on my screen. So if there was anything I went through too quickly, I'm happy to return to that and parse that a little bit more clearly for you.
Okay. So is there any other questions from the attenders? And maybe I would like to add one thing when we are waiting for the other questions. We generally discuss a quote in the lectures about this AI process, about the AI thing and the Blade Runner and the other subjects. The higher the technology and the lower is the life. Do you believe that? Why is technology always presented as the main cause of the problematic life or dystopian future? What is the thing with technology?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure if that's necessarily always the case, but you do see that as a kind of overriding concern in a lot of films and a lot of sort of ways in which we think about it. And I think it may have to do with the tendency to really, I guess, subscribe to a kind of technological determinism, to almost invest too much in the technology, to give it a little bit too much power. And I think that's like some of the driving force behind some of these works too, which is this fear, in a sense, that the technology itself can overwhelm us in certain regards, can sort of exceed us as well in certain regards. And I mean, interestingly, that's not really Terence Broad's concern so much. I don't think he's so much, worried about that kind, but it really kind of speaks to the way in which what technology means to us culturally at any given point in time, and then how that sparks our imagination through media and art and film, and really structures the way in which we want to engage with it.
Yeah, and I think in the pandemic era, we have a different view about the technology. We really trusted a lot to technology, but in the pandemic era, we saw that the nature is bigger than the technology, I guess. Regarding to a small bite of virus, we saw that there is something powerful in nature more than the human technology.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking actually a lot more too about sort of nature in relation to technology in this regard. And even some of the works, and it was sparked a little bit by some of the conversations that I caught in the past session just before this one too. And the way in which we are moving toward, these installations, these sort of like really incredible immersive experiences that are being generated through new technologies and that are being more readily made available to us, through our screens and whatnot. And with respect to nature, it's actually really the environment that needs to come back into this too, because the amount of energy that this sort of data actually requires is an extraordinary sort of drain. And I know there's been really interesting work in different kind of museological sectors that talk about how it takes more energy to keep artworks alive than it does to keep humans alive. So like MoMA, for instance, its energy bill, it far exceeds anything that you can imagine. like a hospital, for instance. So, when we're thinking about all of the things that are sort of opened up by these new technologies, all the possibilities of these new media and these works, there is also, the question of sustainability and the climate crisis, and what exactly is being sort of drawn in order to produce these works and to show these works and to generate these works too. So there's that connection with nature through the pandemic, certainly, where you really feel powerless in a sense for this little virus, but there's also the way in which these works too have that other connection with the climate and with nature and with what the impact of this kind of process and work and the exhibition of it and the archiving of it and data storage and what that drains as well is ultimately sort of having for us. So no, thank you for bringing that connection. It's been something percolating at the back of my mind too when I'm thinking about what are the implications of this connection between art and AI.
Yeah, I bring it to my mind by your presentation, actually. Thanks to you. And I think the key word here is the sustainability. Yeah, I want to highlight that word. And there is another question. Actually, there are two questions, but they look similar. So okay. I would ask Melike and Rana's questions together as one question. Although artificial intelligences are human-made and under human control, can they produce a work of art, or do artificial intelligences have the ability to create?
Oh, that's such a deep philosophical question. And I think it actually presents a real range of intractable problems and is in some ways unanswerable. And it probably, it rests on what your definition is of creativity. What does it mean to create? Who is the author? What degree of control does the author ultimately have in the production of the work? And I mean, we can sort of mine the history of art and see instances where the artist relinquishes control, and that's not even sort of part of it. Things are left to chance, things are left to algorithmic computational sorts of processes as well. So in that sense, it's not particularly new in terms of what AI offers, but it's really something that has, I think, sparked the interest of philosophers to revisit some of these questions in terms of, what can the AI generate? Can the AI generate things we haven't seen before? Absolutely. Create these sort of new ways of working through data and working through whatever kinds of sources are available. Certainly, but there is still that input, right? That input and that kind of the raw material that's still at base here, which is sort of determining it. And I think that also raises some really interesting questions. And I'm interested a lot in failure and some artists that look to, use this sort of new media and technology or whatever you want to call it, and sort of things that showcase why and how stuff goes wrong ultimately. And there's a real kind of sort of fascinating lineage that you can track. So if you're looking at like the black box of AI, the training sets, the data that actually goes into some of these programs that you can access online that artists can use, there's a way in which for a lot of them, they are really relying on certain canons of art, canons of text. And so what gets produced out of that is really quite narrow. So there's some lyric generators, for instance, that musicians can use who are exploring with AI to create a song. But when you start to listen to the lyrics that are generated, you get a very clear sense of what that data set is limited by. And it usually has to do with love, a kind of heterosexual kind of desire, for instance, or somebody pining for something else. So you really get a sense of, the social and political things that are shaping the nature of that training set. And it's the same too, I think, for some art generators or for text generators. If all you're throwing into the mix is a lot of Shakespeare and canonical texts or canonical works, what comes out of that is quite actually highly determined. And you can kind of see it as a failure of creativity in some instances, because these data sets are limiting what actually can eventuate from the processes at work in reconfiguring that data into something else produced by an AI. So it's a really interesting philosophical question. And I think the answer really depends on, this is a very long rambling answer, but the answer depends on how you define creativity, how you define a work, how do you define the artist's role or the author's role in this instance.
Yeah, maybe we must set another webinar for just this question, actually. And my students here are sending a lot of questions. Thanks to them. I'm noticing all of your questions. Thank you, guys. You are so active. I'm really happy to see that. So we have limited time, but I want to share some more questions with you.
If we run out of time, feel free to email to me, and then I will send responses to your students.
That would be nice.
Do that. So if there isn't time to address them all, just send them to me and I'll reply.
That would be a nice solution, because I'm really glad to see their different questions, and they're asking good questions. Actually, they are Z generation and they are thinking in a different point of view. So I will pick one more question for ending this session. I'm looking at them. Sorry, some of them are in Turkish. So this is a basic question, and maybe this doesn't have a brief answer, but I would like to ask this and finish the session. Rana says that, can we say the things that are created by artificial intelligence are a piece of art or not?
You know what? I think that one we can tack on to that other kind of philosophical question about creativity. And you know what? In some way, I think it has the capacity to refresh debates about what constitutes art. I know in my own sort of teaching over the past 20 years or so, we started to move away, like, well, we don't need to ask if it's art. If, this is something a creative gesture put out into the world, we're simply going to assume that that's the case and move on from there and talk about it in a different way. But it almost seems as though AI has reintroduced that question, and maybe with new caveats and with new trajectories to follow about, what actually constitutes art in this kind of current age. And I think in order to even answer that, we probably have to first unpack a series of other questions too, is what constitutes a medium? What constitutes a kind of exploration of a medium? What constitutes creativity? What constitutes a kind of, way of interacting or intervening in the world? And what is the motivating force for that too? So I don't have a good answer for that question at all, but I think it's a really important question to reassess at this point to see how far previous sort of aesthetic theory might take us in even answering it. But then what we have to do to complicate the question itself even in order to start to try to answer it, I think. So those are great questions. Thank you.
Thank you too. I think sometimes I don't have a proper answer is a good answer. So, so this was a good answer too. Thank you very much for joining us today. We were really honored to see you here. It was nice to meet you. And I hope you will join some of our lectures some days.
Absolutely.
Other webinars some days, because I think we have a lot more talk to do. Are there any contributions from my professors, from the students or the listeners, or should we close this session? So thanks very much. Thank you for attending, listening. So thank you, Christine. Thank you, Dr. Sprengler. It was nice to meet you. And it's the end of the session for today, but tomorrow we are continuing from the same link, from the same address, with different keynote speakers. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to tomorrow.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Yarın aynı adreste, aynı linkten devam edeceğiz. Çok teşekkürler katılan herkese. İyi akşamlar diliyoruz.